CAPSI podcast series, Conversations on African Philanthropy.
Welcome to Global Africa Conversations, brought to you by the Wits Business School Center for African Philanthropy and Social Investment. The Global Africa Conversation bring to you global African leaders from different professions, different walks of life, different interests. We have selected feminist leaders, political leaders, entrepreneurs, and NGO leaders who are working on matters of Africa's economic transformation, women's political leadership. This program is normally run by Professor Becky Moyo, who's currently on business leave, and I am standing in for him, and hopefully you will find the replacement half as competent as the main presenter. My name is Brian Tamuka Kagoro, and here we mix humor with seriousness, but we keep it real. Welcome to Global Africa Conversation, convened by the Center for African Philanthropy and Social Investment at the Wits Business School. I am standing in for Professor Becky Moyo, but today I'm joined by a long-term comrade and an outstanding feminist, scholar, activist, but she's going to tell you about herself. Awino, who is Awino Okech? And welcome to the conversation.
Thank you very much, Brian, for having me and for hosting me in this conversation. As other people say, Awino is many things. I'm currently a professor of feminist and security studies at SOAS University of London. I also direct the Feminist Center for Racial Justice, but fundamentally I see myself as a community organizer and somebody who is interested in working and supporting feminist movements in the task of building transformative power across the African continent.
Tell me, what shaped your consciousness? Were you born a feminist? Did you become a feminist? What shaped your consciousness?
So I was raised by a feminist mother. My mother did a lot of work back in the day that was around gender and gender equality work. So I watched firsthand somebody in the home who was very interested and invested in transforming women and girls' lives and conditions. As somebody who was an educator, she was a teacher. She did a lot of that work already in schools. And when she transitioned out of teaching to run a development organization, her work was primarily focused on trying to shift the conditions for girls in schools and to deal with the situation of why girls were, dropping out of school and retention. So I got involved in that work and watched her very closely. But she also raised very strong for women, her daughters. And so I had no choice but to understand that as women, we have power. We live in a complex environment in which that power is constantly being negotiated away from us. And how do you develop the fortitude? And those tools also include learning. It includes understanding your self-worth and self-identity to navigate the world. Yeah.
There are all sorts of conceptions out there about feminism. They range from ultra ridiculous to amusing to tragic. What is feminism?
So feminism is the basic idea. I read this quote once and I love it. Feminism is the basic idea that women are people. And that is the work that we do. We seek to ensure that the world recognizes that women are human beings who deserve equal rights and entitlements in our society, and that the way in which power is structured in our society creates a lopsided environment for women and girls. Obviously, over time, that understanding of women and girls as a category has shifted to thinking much more broadly about gender in an expansive way. So really at its core, it's about challenging how power is structured in our societies and how gender is central to structuring those power relations in our societies.
Is there a difference between African feminism and other feminisms?
I think there's a difference in as far as paying attention to context. I think at its base, all feminisms are interested in the idea of challenging and questioning power. A lot of the debates that happened that led to the development of Marxist feminists or black feminists and African feminists are rooted in trying to emphasize particular things. So Marxist feminists, for instance, say you cannot talk about gender equality without paying attention to class.
Yeah.
Black feminists argued you cannot talk about feminism and assume that we all operate and navigate the world in the same way. Race matters to that conversation. As Africans, we say pay attention to context and that there are knowledge systems from the African continent that are critical to understanding gender, and we cannot assume that the way gender is understood in the global north is the same way it's understood on the African context. So it's those sets of knowledge systems that we bring to bear in our analysis and in the work that we do across movements.
One might ask a stupid question. Can you, for example, when you're looking at the last, since 1979, the Nairobi convening, have we made progress in terms of, in the space of officialdom, the space of society, in the understanding, or at least the recognition of women's equal humanity?
Absolutely. I think even though there are reversals consistently, which is what contestations about power are always about, we must recognize that there have been significant shifts. Shifts both in relation to the kind of language that has been introduced in international frameworks. Off the top of my head, if you think about the Beijing platform as a critical set of a plan of action that continues to be celebrated, at this particular moment, including the introduction of conflict that came from African activists, 1325 on women, peace and security. Think about the constitutional shifts that have happened across many of our African countries, from the simple but important thing of women being able to pass on citizenship, to their children and spouses, to basic voting rights, to the, position of women in electoral and other kinds of political spaces, improvements in girls' education and access to education, to what we see now in my own country, Kenya, to the kinds of provisions that are made for women and young people in relation to access to government contracts, etc. So lots of progress. And I think where we see reversals, those reversals are around those in power seeking to claw back their own power and seeing that as a point of debate.
Globally, we're seeing the rise of all sorts of networks. Some claiming traditional values, family values, original values. What is this about?
As a feminist, I believe that if you think about how our societies and nation states are organized, gender sits at the heart of it. You cannot think about the reproduction of societies without thinking about women's reproductive capacities. You cannot think about the sustenance of cultural values without thinking about women's place in the home and how women are used as central vectors, if you will, for the transmission of culture across our societies. Consequently, the rise of these movements, whether they're named fascist, anti-gender movements, whether those discourses are embedded in, the policies and rhetoric of governments and presidents such as Trump, to the former Brazilian president Bolsonaro, at its heart is about returning to a conservative idea of what societies are, putting women back in their place, and recognizing that the kinds of gains that have happened in relation to gender equality have created a disequilibrium in the way society is structured. And that disequilibrium is about a shift in the organization of power across societies, which has redistributed power. And I think it is the redistribution of power in a society.
That is the contest.
That is the contest.
Okay. Why do you think Africans are uncritically in certain power circles embracing this, because I was reflecting the other day saying this continent, more than any other continent, in its 2,800-year history, has had the highest number of female rulers and people cite, and warriors, Queen Zinga, Nefertiti, and etc. And I like to remind people that these were not married to kings. They were the premier or primary rulers. And even with our most inelegant, undemocratic systems, other than India, other than Asia, where you had Benazir Bhutto in Pakistan, who was part of the ruling family, and the Indira Gandhi, and a few other places like the UK that had Maggie Thatcher. Very few other places have had, we still count, of course, out of 55, that there are few, have had as many women in positions of authority. Still totally inadequate, but in comparison to the rest, if you look at the number of women in the US cabinet, if you look at why do you think the idea still that there are still components of society that are resistant?
I'll answer that question by telling you a story. Just after Donald Trump was elected for a second term, I was home and I spent some time with some close relatives. What shocked me in the course of that conversation was how around the table, the men who were around the table were strong defenders of Donald Trump's policies. Now remember, these are not people who vote in the US. These are upwardly mobile Kenyans that I was talking to, well-educated Kenyans. And underpinning their position around the support of his policies and his rhetoric were two things: culture and religion, that were operating very closely in terms of how they thought about how the world was getting chaotic. We are now moving too far to the left. And the questions around which they said we are moving too far to the left were really around questions of gender and sexuality. So back to your question about why we see very limited progress in relation to letting women ascend to significant positions of power, at its core is this convergence of culture and religion, very conservative ideas about the place of women in society. So that even when there's a little progress, it is the progress that is seen as just enough. We have given you just enough access to a space that we believe is fundamentally for men. And you should not now take liberties to try and get more. Yeah.
You know, it's a very interesting take. Black men in Africa would be outraged by racial discrimination. As we are seeing now, they are joining a bandwagon around this Christian genocide. And in fact, would be outraged by instances of sodomy rape. But the minute you talk about male rape of females, they are either indifferent or neutral. Walk us through your analysis of this, that injustice, when it happens a little remote from you, same injustice, you are outraged by it, you're willing to act on it. But when it is closer home, you balk at the possibility of even naming it as such.
I think it's a complex thing, you know, and I think part of it is psychological. But let me say two things, and I want to speak to the race one and the question of sexual violence. I think that when people are able to defend the exclusion of particular groups of people on the basis of gender and sexuality, but view racial violence or racial exclusion as something to balk at, I think in those instances, they have sort of separated. Feminists always argue that as women, we have to think about our gender identity consistently. It's not something we pack away in the bag. When we travel in the world, that is something that is central. For men, their gender is not something that they think about when they travel in the world. They're just operating in the world. And on occasion, they might then be forced to remember, oh, I'm a man navigating the world. So it's sort of something, an identity that's in the backseat. So I think in those moments, they're forced to confront the intersection of race and gender in ways that are quite palpable, that they've never had to deal with in other instances. But I also think that for those who sort of see themselves as removed from the kind of racial violence, it's a kind of othering. The people, the black men they're talking about is not me, right? It's a different kind of black man who is, their class positioning, their education, etc. is very different. So the kind of adjacency to whiteness that they sort of also put themselves in means that they think of themselves as different from the others who are being described. When I lived here in South Africa, I would be sitting with some of these white Afrikaners who would say, no, you are a different African. I'm not talking about you. I'm talking about those other Africans,
You are more civilized.
Exactly.
And sophisticated.
Exactly. And I think in relation to sexual violence, I've never understood that, Brian, so I'm not even going to pretend that I have an explanation for why, if I told my brother that something had happened to me, he would be absolutely outraged. But if I told him that he should be equally outraged at Evans Kidero slapping Rachel Shebesh, he would say, but that's an unruly woman, she talks too much, So there's these kinds of explanations we make about respectability, and the kind of women who are defensible, whose virtue is defensible, while others are not,
The good women.
The good women, yeah.
So tell me something. We've been thinking about two things. Clearly, what we see as these inequities must be understood in many ways, including the global dimension. What are the global system structures that are sustaining this racism, that are patriarchy? How is it reflected in global structures of governance and the systems of power?
Yeah. I think obviously now you cannot think about questions of gender and racial equality outside of thinking about the sort of political economy that sustained that. So for scholars who think about racial capitalism or write about it, they will argue that capitalism is sustained, by the exploitation and the extraction of black labor, and that is what underpins it. So if you want to talk about plantation economies to questions around the extraction of, rare, minerals on the African continent, or even how we think about questions of slavery, for instance. But alongside that, or adjacent to that, is the same way that you can argue that the labor of a lot of our societies is reliant on the gendered distribution of labor and the unequal distribution of that gendered labor, whether it is in the economy, in politics, and the social cultural systems that then sort of travel right up to the top to ensure that women are paid less. Their, care labor is not recognized in the same way. Those who sustain informal economies are not necessarily, provided with the infrastructure and conditions to be able to do their job effectively, yet they're the ones who feed, most of our families, across various parts of the African continent, and I think even globally. So, in my view, it is this, if you want to call it imperialism, if you want to talk about capitalism, those for me are the base infrastructure that then intersect with questions of gender and race to ensure that this becomes a sort of canker that is very difficult to untangle, because you're not just talking about patriarchy here in the corner as a social cultural issue. No, it's deeply embedded and woven in the very system that sustains a lot of our societies and which we are forced to buy into, as we navigate the world today.
So these extremities, women, when we face vulnerability as the caregivers, the last frontier for keeping us alive.
Yeah.
Women as a threat or a danger.
Yeah.
Women, almost the same way that people used to think about black folk, as criminalization of women, where these laws that are called colonial laws that were adopted, loitering for the purposes of prostitution was a crime. Procuring the services of a commercial sex worker wasn't a crime. And then there were vagrancy laws and etc. So whole body of colonial laws that created the black people in this region, Southern Africa, as criminals by virtue of presence or migration or movement, created women as, if you like, quadruple criminals. You couldn't go out of the country with your own child without getting a written letter of permission from. You couldn't transfer citizenship to your own child, and etc. and etc. So we've been independent now for some time. So this coloniality of both our legal processes, our policy processes, and the thinking in public policy. Have we decolonized? Have we arrived at a stage where where policies are really our ideas of society, or we now have this hodgepodge where the culture, religion, colonial constructs, and whatever else in between determines how we regulate the bodies of women, the lives of women, the economic endeavor of women, and etc.
No, I don't think we've fully decolonized. I don't think our policies and laws are really rooted in our African sensibilities, and that is because, many of the people who are running our countries are, to use Paulo Freire's words, people who want to ape the oppressor, right? So that is their mission. In terms of how they lead and think about policies, that's why many of our countries are being mortgaged, to the highest bidder. I mean, you think about, the whole kerfuffle that happened across various African countries, but also in Kenya, around hiring, these bridge international academies to come and design an education system that is failing our young people. And this is public education, yet the wealthy can run off to, to private, private schools and are not compromised in that way. So you're in essence building an entire generation of people with compromised education. There is no way,
They can compete.
Exactly. So yeah, and I think for me this then leads us to what do we need to do now. We have seen a revitalization. I'm not going to say it's new, it's a revitalization of young people engaging from where they're at in relation to changing the stake, claiming their stake and changing, seeking to change their countries. But if our own knowledge systems are broken, if their own knowledge systems are broken, if their own ideological base is weak, then I fear for the future that is ahead, even though I am very, very galvanized and I feel very hopeful by the energy that I see with the young people across Africa.
So what must we disrupt?
I think three things. I am I've become like a broken record on this. I think we must go back to what your generation did, what the 1960s generation did of building political schools. We must be ideologically sound, and we must educate ourselves. That work does not always happen in the classroom. It does not happen in university lecture halls. It happens outside, and we must go back to that. That's the first thing. The second thing is to recognize, and again, there's lots of social movement scholarship that tells us this, but also our own organizing histories tell us this. While direct action is an important, visible, galvanizing moment, the boiler room work must happen. We are not going to liberate our countries largely through protests. It's important, but we then have to put in place systems that have to outlive the protest moment.
Yeah.
And that is the work we need to now encourage, the young people who are leading from the front to step back into the skill set that exists, with various people, so that we can build that blueprint for the future. The third is a transnational conversation. And by transnational here, I mean the fact that what happens in Kenya has a contagion effect in Uganda and Tanzania, or even to Morocco, or even to Madagascar. We have to build better conversations across some of these regions because our problems are the same. We are seeing the same problems across these countries. And if you have a strong country here and a country that's crumbling next door, that problem is going to come. across your borders very soon. You know, and this is not a question of blocking migration, but it's a question of ensuring that across the African continent, we are stronger together, rather than having 3 or 4 countries that are seen as the bigwigs and everyone else around you is crumbling.
You know, we've been observing an interesting phenomenon, a generational shift, younger people seizing the moment, and an interesting contradiction in Malawi and elsewhere, and them re-electing fairly old people.
Yeah.
Between this consciousness, and I'll tell you what was exciting me as I watched from a distance. Historically, we almost had believed that you couldn't organize except through religious and ethnic enclaves. And these young people come along, whether you call them Gen Z or whatever, and they were organizing online without reference to a tribe or a religion. In fact, it was phenomenal. Young Muslims, Baha'i, Christians, other religions, they had and they didn't even call themselves by the usual traditional classes, working class, and they were just organizing. And then, of course, the beautiful moment happens. They catalyze this moment of expectation. And we go back to the old business of conquest and retention of power, whether through elections or, as we have seen elsewhere, through military rule. And it seems there's a chasm between this vibe, this energy, this difference, and where this matter settled, from Tunisia to... And you've written a book looking at movements. How do we address this gap between power, political power to be specific, and this phenomenal mobilization that you described beyond the things that you've already enumerated? Is there something else that can be done?
Yes, and I think that thing is about preparing for power. So, you know, part of the issue, you know, is that the kinds of movements that we've seen are galvanized at specific moments, and they tend to dissipate. And that's why that long-term work is important, because that long-term work is about preparing for power. It's about saying that we know what we don't want, right? Now, what is it that we want? And what are the things that we need to build for that? Is it a political vehicle? Is it about engaging X, Y, and Z? And I don't think enough of that happens. That's why you see what happens in Tunisia happening, in Egypt, in Zimbabwe, we can name it, or even in Kenya, when we saw, you know, the president quickly regroup, other actors take advantage of the opportunity. We have enough lessons, Brian, for us to know that a vacuum will be created, and those, whether you call them the deep state or whether you call it political opportunists, will swoop in, because that is what they were waiting for.
They're skilled.
They're skilled at that, you know, and that is what we need to be better at. Don't create a vacuum that you're not going to fill, you know. And that requires, as my closing reflection, is to think about who we cannot work with and people who we must work with in a particular moment, right?
We have to make hard choices.
We have to make hard choices, yes.
So finally for me, you know, we often have within this movement space either extreme Puritanism. You have to be, you know, used to have this thing in the left and in the Pan-Africanist movement. You have to be Pan-Africanist to no fault or to a fault. Otherwise, how do we mediate the gray areas of movement that may arise as a result of strategy differences, strategic differences, and sometimes ideological? I remember in the left, the debates between Trotsky and Lenin, and in the feminist movement, the debates, the raging debates of the 80s and 90s between radical feminists and in the so-called Pan-Africanist movement post-1994, in the debates between Kenyu, Tajuddin Abdul Rahim, others saying we can't totally ignore the African state, and others saying no, the state is a traitor.
Yeah.
Let's do. And we failed because we didn't figure out how to negotiate these differences. So often everyone walked away with those that agreed with them. And when we did so, the status quo remained. So do you have any, as a parting shot, how do we negotiate the gray areas and the difference?
Yeah. I have two reflections in that, and I can't believe I'm about to cite who I'm about to cite. But the late Honorable Raila Odinga, in the moment when joined KANU, the Kenya African National Union, and contributed to its
Demise.
Yeah. And there were tensions, amongst the people who were there about who should lead and who is being overseen and all of these things. And it is said that he then eventually said to his comrades that, listen, we must not focus on who amongst us is going to lead. Our goal should be to get Moi out. And that should be our objective. I find that a useful way to think about how to navigate differences, because we must consistently remind ourselves, what is our core objective?
What is the price?
Yeah, what is the price that we are going for? And so long as we all want to get to that price, then we have to also be willing to make some trade-offs, right? And unless there are very, very hard red lines that are around specific things, but trade-offs are always going to be necessary. Otherwise, we will not get to that price. I think the second thing, in relation to why sometimes it's difficult for people to think about trade-offs, is that we are always working towards the world we want, but we live in the now. That perfect world does not exist yet. That's what we are working towards. So how do we resolve the contradictions of this moment while we continue to aspire to that perfect world? To the ideal. Because I think a lot of times people are very stuck on the utopia, but we are here.
Like somebody said, we don't make history in the circumstances of our choosing.
Yes.
I'm tempted to do this because we're down. Maybe let me stay out of national politics as it is and just ask. Agwambo dies and forces the world to retell his story, almost literally. And I must, by the way, say that his youngest daughter impressed me phenomenally in her poise and her command of. But Agwambo dies from critics to friends to neutrals. Suddenly we say, some brick has been taken out of the foundation. Your reflections on the post-Agwambo, like Agwambo is no more. And people are chanting from Joey to... And your reflections on what this means for the region, for Kenya, and for those of us who are talking about transformation of political power in Africa. Any lessons from Agwambo's life and Agwambo's own philosophy?
One big lesson for me watching the current moment after Raila's passing is we must be intentional about transition planning, and we must be intentional about thinking about our legacies, because there is a huge generational conversation that is happening at the moment, and I don't think Raila's generation was good at that, and we can very easily fall into that trap ourselves, where we become the center of issue. Exactly. We must be intentional, and that's why I believe this intergenerational work with the current activists is absolutely critical. It's not about saying you're irrelevant because you're a person of the past. There's a lot of handing over the baton, working together, accompanying each other that remains critical.
Professor Awino Okech, thank you so much for making the time at a very short notice, but for sharing, I think, deep insights in what is the struggle at hand, and some reflections on some lessons. My own reflections as we close out is we were a generation that thought we would never leave the struggle. We will always be there. We're also a generation that perhaps didn't pay enough attention to the fact that younger people and even children were growing, that they would not always accept what we thought and said is true, and we were not ready to be questioned. And as such, we also didn't build bridges, but also never imagined that the young people would come and want to raise to the ground some things we had built in order to build up better. And that's my takeaway as we reflect on societies. My most profound appreciation is, as I listen to you enumerate some of the progress made, that the struggle hasn't entirely been in vain.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And the question, maybe you can reflect for a few seconds on this. How do we resource the struggles? We know that our traditional sugar daddies and rich sugar daddies and mummies are not there anymore or are retreating. Our so-called fair weather friends have left us. How do we resource the transformation we desire?
I think two main ways. One, we must require, I'm using the word require, our wealthy Africans to invest in the struggle, because their businesses are not going to thrive in a country that does not exist, right? So from your Masiiwas to your Dangotes, they should not see the work of transforming our societies as something that is disruptive to business. It should be seen as something they need to support in order to create the kinds of societies that we want, so that you're building those societies, right? And there are multiple ways in which that work can be resourced from within the African continent. Secondly, I think we are being forced in this moment to think ourselves as those who run organizations, who are working with movements in different ways, how we build financial infrastructures that are not about private philanthropy within our context. Whether that, again, is about thinking much more broadly about how mutual aid infrastructures do that for us, how we think much more broadly about long-term investments. We have to dance with capitalism a little bit, how to, invest in things that bring back resources in order for us to feed the work that we do. So that, I think, is a key area that we must think about now. Yeah.
Well, there is hope. Thank you so much, Awino. You have the wonderful rest of the day. And for those of you who are watching us, we keep reflecting. The continent is not short of ideas. Are you ready to be part of movements that are contributing to the transformation of Africa? See you next time.
You've been listening to the CAPSI podcast series, Conversations on African Philanthropy.